right, thank you so much for making the time to join us today. It's a pleasure to have this session today about Bromley by Bow Centre and co-production. And so I'm Berenice. I am the Knowledge Share and Exchange Program Manager within the Insights team at Bromley by Bow. So I run workshops and webinars, very much such as this one. We traditionally have done visits to the centre. Obviously, at the moment, it's not possible to physically visit the centre, but we are making sure to keep sharing anything we've learned or any best practice and exchanging some knowledge and through any means we can. So that means Zoom at the moment. So that's what we're doing now. My colleague is with me, Daniel Hopewell. You've seen him in the pre-recorded video, hopefully. So Dan, do you want to introduce yourself very shortly?
Hi, I'm Dan Hopewell. It's great to have you with us virtually today. As Berenice says, we would normally, and we have indeed welcomed Darzi Fellow groups at Bromley by Bow for many years, maybe even up to 10 years, I think. So you follow in the footsteps of many others as well. And it's wonderful to have you here today and to share some of our learning and some of our thinking and to discuss that with you and help to create new ways of working around health and community. Yeah.
Thank you, Dan. So just briefly today, so hopefully you've seen the 3 kind of pre-recorded videos before the session. If not, don't worry, we'll send them again to you afterwards. So there was the introduction to Bromley by Bow and a short introduction to communities driving change as well, and DIY health. So what we're going to do today is Dan is going to kind of give us a little virtual tour of the center. We've got a short video that we're trying to recreate the feeling of being at the center. So we'll walk through that together, and then we'll talk a little bit more about co-production, the challenges, the benefits, and kind of answer some of your questions that you've been asking before the session. And then we'll have a short Q&A with Jessica, who was presenting communities driving change in the video. We'll have some breakout room discussions, a tea break as well, some feedback and discussion again, and then Q&A with Nassim from DIY Health. So that's we've got a nice and full program. At any time, feel free to ask any questions you have. So either in the chat or by raising your hand on Zoom and kind of unmuting yourself and things. So yeah, this is very much of an interactive session. So don't hesitate to ask questions at any time or make any comments and things like that. It's very welcome as well. So Dan, do you want to say a few words before we go into the video?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Berenice. I think in trying to understand Bromley by Bow and why it's so important for the system, it's really important to understand where we're coming from. And I talk about that in the video that you will have seen, hopefully, before you came through to today's live session. But it's around redefining what our fundamental purpose really is. I was fortunate enough to, Bromley by Bow's heavily featured in a King's Fund report that's about to be published about premises. It's about the Bromley by Bow model. It features extensively in this report, and it sort of asks the question, if Bromley by Bow has been held up as an example over the last 20 years of a way forwards around health and community, what are the barriers to the growth of new Bromley by Bows, and what are the barriers to Bromley by Bow's ethos and learning being incorporated by the health system? And we had an hour-and-a-half round table yesterday with some very senior health leaders, including people from NHS Property Services as well, people involved in social prescribing across the country, architects, King's Fund experts, and a wide range of people from general practice and the health system, all really asking that question: why has the Bromley by Bow model not been more replicated, or why has it not woven its way into general practice? Why doesn't general practice across Britain look like Bromley by Bow? I think one of the fundamental things to understand about Bromley by Bow is that it's 2/3 not about health, if you like, to understand the world from the perspective of the NHS. There's a general practice at Bromley by Bow. That's only about 1/3 or 1/4 of what we do on site. About 3/4 of what we do are social programs delivered by another team of staff who work for the charity, who work for the Bromley by Bow Centre. About 80 staff who deliver community services, non-health services to the community, whether it's welfare advice or legal advice or financial capability and money management or adult learning or employability programs, digital inclusion programs, outreach onto housing estates, filmmaking, pottery, dance programs, community choirs, all these sorts of things, and a lot of programs around looking after your health in a non-clinical way. That's 3/4 of what we do. 1/4 of what we do is general practice, but perhaps the most important thing is how those two work together, how we try to create and meld one team. And I think the reason that that has been successful is because for the first 15 years, we didn't even have general practice on site. We were a crumbling East End church, as I described in the mid-1980s. So we grew out of community, and we grew out of what is important to community. We then realized, of course, that health is important, clinical health is important to community as well. And we added general practice to the model 15 years into our journey. But it really has its basis in community and what local people want and so on. And that sort of inspired and fed our values. We have 4 active values at Bromley by Bow, which are to be compassionate, to be a friend, to have fun, and assume it's possible, which are, of course, their values, their human values, but they also inform the interaction and the role of institutions within communities and the role of our professionals within communities as well. You know, be compassionate and be a friend. It's about saying that if co-production and community empowerment are to work, professionals need to change who they are, and they need to act very differently. One of the GPs on yesterday's roundtable with the King's Fund and NHS, a GP who's a great friend of Bromley by Bow from South London, was saying he didn't realise until he started to examine it how much power he had as a GP. He was one of the most powerful professionals in the community. And he had to learn how to use that power completely differently if he wanted to work with the community. And he said he spent a lot of his time actually brokering relationships between voluntary sector organisations and the health system and statutory services. And he saw himself as a connector of lots and lots of organisations and how to work together in the part of South London where he works. So I think thinking fundamentally about what our purpose is, which is we're trying to create health rather than treat illness. And there's a fundamental difference between the two. And Bromley by Bow is very much around trying to create health within a very deprived and very unhealthy community, rather than just simply treating illness. And of course, the NHS was set up to treat illness, not to create health. And that's the really fundamental shift that we have to move ourselves into. Great, Berenice, shall we go on a tour of Bromley by Bow? And let's welcome you into this innovative community and health hub. And we've got some slides now that will help to kind of take us through the centre. So you arrive off the Blackwall Tunnel approach road, a thundering 6-lane highway, and you walk down this little street in East London, and then you come across this stone arch that leads into this really quite a magical space. People often equate it to a Mediterranean courtyard with wisteria, seats to sit at that invite you just to sit and stop and loiter, or maybe run an art program for older people called Young at Art, which is about getting older people together, which is based on our leg ulcer clinic. There's Bromley by Bow on a winter's day. Really interesting architecture, very non-institutional architecture. These sort of overhanging pergolas walking in here through a glazed entrance into the health centre. There you can see it again. So very interesting transitions from external space to interior space. Sculpture everywhere, so and art everywhere. A whole centre that's been very informed by artists. There you can see this is the waiting room in general practice. And the seating is arranged to facilitate and encourage interaction between the patients. There's a group room. We do lots of group rooms, group activities with patients, really important, thinking about the future of primary care. We need less one-to-one consulting rooms and more group rooms. In quarry tiles, lots of glass, wood, natural materials. The screens that are in there painted by local people. This is our church, where we do a whole host of activities. One of the first things that happened in the church actually was to transform it into a nursery. So for about 30 years, the church actually was a nursery during the week. We run our seminar program. You'd be sitting there now today if the centre was open. That's Emma, who runs our population health work, and we'll talk about that. Some of our nurses talking to a group visiting Bromley by Bow. That's Bromley by Bow today. It's full of food. We're running a food bank that feeds about 800 families every week. That gives you an idea of some of the challenges in our communities in the UK at the moment, as I'm sure you're aware. COVID has had an absolutely catastrophic effect on our communities. This is the church, so that's where it all grew out of, this East London church. And there we are, loitering with intent, opportunity to sit and chat. There's the 3-acre park that we transformed from that black and white photo that you've seen in the video to this beautiful 3-acre community park that is an intrinsic part of, there you are, there we have a summer fair. So it's like the village green, really. It's where the community gathers for community events. And there's an older people's tea party, or actually intergenerational tea party. There's a shot in our cafe. Those mosaic tables were made by local people. There's Flo in the kitchen. She was one of our kitchen staff. There's the cafe. Those mosaic tables were made by local people, and with some of the crockery that was found in the park when we transformed the park. But that gives you an idea. Our doctors have lunch in the park at the end of morning surgery, and their patients are sitting at other tables having lunch as well. So that gives you an idea of how we can use the park. There's the front end. It's called the connection zone. People get free use of the internet there, free access to telephones and printing, so on. There we've got people using computers, and it's managed by both paid staff and by volunteers in the connection zone. That's a community fridge. It's full of melons. So it's a community fridge. It's also part of the same sort of program around food security as the food bank as well. And there's some of our art activities. That's a program for people with elder people and people with learning disabilities. There's one of our computer classes running, one of our computer suites, indeed. So teaching people how to use computers is very important, particularly this time where digital exclusion is such an important issue. There's our park again on a good sunny day, and more shots of our park. So the park is looked after and tended to by paid gardeners, but also by local people who are working as gardeners and supporting that. There's the children's playground on the right, a huge sculptural bench in the middle there. And it's like walking through a woodland glade, really, coming into the park. So beauty and aesthetics are really important as well. There's some of our allotment beds, and there's one of our gardening groups. So gardening and horticulture is very, very important. There are 2 of our gardeners who are part of a program as well. So that gives you an idea of the kind of the quality of the Bromley by Bow Centre in terms of what it is and what it's like to be there. Great. Now, Berenice, I think I'm right that I've got a few minutes now to respond to some of the questions that you that people have posed. Is that right? We've got 15 minutes now. Is that correct?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. So we're going to go through some of the questions that you've asked in the pre-session questionnaire, but in the meantime as well, if other questions came to your mind, or those people didn't have time to fill in the form, then feel free to ask in the chat or raise your hand on Zoom and ask your question away. And so some of the questions were about so the first thing was we wanted to build a health center. Sorry, that's what you said in the introduction to Bromley by Bow. So who was the we? Was that the doctors or the community?
So that's a really interesting question. I guess it goes to the heart of co-production and Bromley by Bow's journey from a crumbling church in the mid-1980s onwards, and the involvement of the community, the invitation of the community to come in and to inhabit the church's space. The building of relationships, I think, then becomes critical. The idea of grouping a group of people around the church, artists, local people, Bangladeshi community, the remains of the sort of white working class community of East London as it was, and new people who were coming in, artists and musicians, and people who had been involved in community development work in India, for example. We had quite a lot of squatting in East London at the time, and short life housing and so on. So quite a mix of people came into Bromley by Bow. And it was really their ideas that were the kind of thing that set the tone for what Bromley by Bow is and would become. And so when we talk about whose inspiration it was to add health to this kind of small community hub, that really grew out of the community itself and the dissatisfaction with the quality of primary care as it then was in the area. I talk about that in the video, and the kind of really poor support that one of our volunteers got in the final months of her life from the health system and actually the local authority as well. And our desire for a higher quality of health provision, but also the thought that could health work with all these other things that we were doing? And I think that was really the important thing. So the impetus came from the community. It came from some of the professionals who were also working within Bromley by Bow at the time, who were starting to work there. But I think that's really important in understanding this balance of power, if you like, that Bromley by Bow didn't grow out of some planning meeting in the local strategic health authority, or similarly some planning meeting in the council offices. It grew out of the community, and that has been really important, I think, ever since. And although we have NHS funded health provision, of course, now, I think it's really important in terms of maintaining some of the vision of the centre, but also maintaining an understanding of what we're trying to achieve, and the fact that primarily it's the community that will be able to solve its own problems, obviously with support of professionals, but it isn't a role solely for the professionals, and that the community are really, really important in that. So, it goes absolutely to the heart of what we're talking about today, which is around co-production. Yeah.
So kind of very briefly, there's a bit more of a practical question, but how is Bromley by Bow funded in terms of the community and the health centres? Are they funded differently?
Yeah, so our primary care practices, and we now have 3 practices and co-manage a 4th, so in total about 40,000 patients. They are funded in exactly the same way that GP practices, all GP practices in England are funded, and they're funded through different contracting arrangements. One's APMS contracts and the other are GPMS contracts, but they are funded in exactly the same way and to exactly the same level as other GP practices in England. The charity itself, the Bromley by Bow Centre, the charity that employs the 80 or so staff who deliver non-clinical services, is funded also in exactly the same way that other charities are funded in England, i.e. it's funded through the charity fundraising for itself. So the Bromley by Bow Centre as a charity has an income of around about £3 million a year. and that money to deliver the non-clinical services that are part of the model. So we're not funded by the state to deliver the model as such. We seek funding for, in every year, about 40 different projects that in aggregate deliver the model. So whether it's welfare advice or money management or adult learning or employability or healthy lifestyles work, those are all programs that are fundraised for by the charity itself. But it's the work of the charity fundraising for those programs in combination with general practice that creates the whole model. Yeah. So I hope that answers that question. I think we need to say that it's not necessary to have something of quite the size of Bromley by Bow to make this model work. We know of GP practices that work in conjunction with much, much smaller charities, for example, which is important to say. Or in Stockwell, we know of a GP practice that works with about 40 kind of community groups and charities in its neighborhood, and has sort of created a version of Bromley by Bow by working with lots of much smaller organizations in its community. They're not all based on the same site. The GP practice is the only thing that's based on the GP practice site. Their premises don't have space for more organizations to be in the same building. But what they have done is to forge relationships with about 40 other organizations and community groups and community leaders as well. So some individuals as well in that group. And it's kind of created a distributed model of Bromley by Bow by forming those relationships. Berenice, another question I think was about the research that we did, the Unleashing Healthy Communities research. So hopefully you may have seen that research. It's on our website, and it's funded by Public Health England, the Wellcome Trust, the Health Foundation, and OCS. And it was the beginnings of research into the Bromley by Bow model. We had 2 embedded researchers with us for 2 years. They produced a fantastic report and included community research, or what's called citizen science, which is about employing local people to research their own community. That has led to the establishment of 6 outcomes, and we're now in the process of implementing these outcomes, beginning to implement these outcomes. The work was very much fed back to the community. We ran lots and lots of sharing days and workshops with the community that both informed the research, but also fed back the research as it was undergone through those 2 years. The community research continues at Bromley by Bow, actually. So we continue that dialogue with our community through that and through our engagement programs. In a sense, Bromley by Bow is a sort of 35-year process of exchange and interchange and dialogue between the staff, the volunteers, and the community. So it's a continual ongoing process of dialogue and exchange of views. So it's not just about the Unleashing Healthy Communities research that happens. But yes, Berenice, what do we have as another question? I think there was one about the tension between volunteers and paid staff, I remember. Which I think is a really interesting question. And I think there is undoubtedly, as you have picked up through asking that question, there is a tension there. And I think it's one that's hard to manage, particularly it has to be said in a community where there are high and significant levels of unemployment, where a lot of people are wanting to get a job. That's somewhat different to volunteering, for people who maybe have had a professional career and are now entering retirement and seeking to volunteer to, in inverted commas, give something back to the community, who aren't seeking employment. The reality is that many of our volunteers are on a journey towards employment, and volunteering for them is a stepping stone towards gaining the skills, the capabilities that they might need for employment, and also the connections that they need. Including the ability to put something on their CV that they're actively doing at the moment, and so on. So I think one has to be aware there is that tension there, and some people, and we have a limited capacity to absorb all of the people in our community who would like a job, of course. So we have to also be feeding volunteers into situations where it can lead to them getting employment as well, you know, which is a key consideration for many of our volunteers, not for all of them. Some of our volunteers are very, very long-term and are very content with that role. I think it's really important to recognize, though, that volunteers are not substitute employees, and that they have a different role and their contribution is different, and that it's very important to understand what volunteers are wanting to get out of that experience of being a volunteer. Great.
Yep, that's great. So there was another question about how do you avoid inequality when reaching out to the community? I think that's quite linked to what you were talking about just now. Is there a risk of only the keen and engaged stepping forward and this group not necessarily being the one with greatest social or health issues?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question as well, and one that I don't think one can give a perfect answer to. The reality is, of course, that we have massive inequalities in our communities. And I think what this question is alluding to is that very often the people who most need services are those who most least access those services. We also have, of course, something called the inverse care law, which was established a couple of decades ago, that the poorest and most deprived communities in Britain who have the greatest health needs also are the ones with the lowest expenditure by the NHS. They have a lower ratio of doctors to patients. They often have the poorer health facilities and they have less of them. So there's an inverse care law there, which I think is really interesting. But there is no perfect answer to this question, I think. How do you ensure that those who most need services are the ones who are engaged, and you're not just picking up the people who are either active or on the cusp of being active? What I think it does require is outreach, door knocking. You know, forget the kind of formal channels of communication, forget leaflets, forget posters, forget digital to some extent. You know, that's not how our community understands things. It's not how our community becomes aware of things. Our community becomes aware of things by word of mouth, by recommendation from local people who access services, who speak highly of them to their neighbours. It involves employing local people. You know, we, Bromley by Bow, between the health partnership and the charity, employ somewhat upwards of around about 250 staff. So a good proportion of those staff are local people, and that is really important. That represents a strong set of connections then between the centre and the people who live locally. Involving volunteers is really important as well. The fact that the centre has a throughput of many hundreds of people every day who are accessing general practice, accessing the vast range of services that we provide, or simply coming into the cafe and having lunch and a cup of coffee. Of course, all of those contact points are opportunities to build relationships with people. Employing people who are representative of the community in terms of ethnicity is also really important, in terms of gender is important. But, you know, there are groups who are harder to reach. Men are notoriously hard to reach. Women put themselves forwards for programs, you know, whether it's learning computers or learning English, or but, you know, probably a ratio of 10 to 1 or 5 to 1 against women, for example, of all ethnicities, you know, so, you know, men are hard to find, for example, and, you know, and if you talk to any community group across the country, they will tell you the same story. You know, men are just notoriously bad at putting themselves forwards, even when they've got similar needs to women around their health, or struggling to manage money, or whatever it happens to be, as an example. But yes, so those are some of the ways that we do it. It's through human contact. It's through investing in outreach teams, in terms of investing in community development teams, like the ones that Jess is going to talk about in a minute. This is the way you reach people. but you cannot guarantee that. You might have fantastic contact with one family whose grandparents access services, whose parents access services, whose children access services, and living right next door to them is another family that you have barely any contact with whatsoever. I mean, that is the reality. But let us also not forget that, of course, at the moment, the system is working very, very, very poorly. We have rising, ever since the mid-1980s, we have had rising inequality in Britain, and it continues to rise year on year. And we have rising health inequality as well. You know, we have a 20-year healthy life expectancy gap between the richest and the poorest in Britain, who may well be living in neighboring streets. So the current system is very, very, very far from perfect. The fact that everybody has access to general practice, you know, doesn't mean to say that we have health equality, partly because health equality is not driven by the NHS, it's driven by the social and economic factors in people's lives. So we can but do our best, but it does involve stepping outside of buildings and outside of institutions, and it involves redesigning buildings, such as Bromley by Bow, to become places that people want to come to spend their time in, to do art in, to sing in, to have tea and coffee in, or to sit in a beautiful 3-acre park with their family in the summer and have a picnic, or have the kids kicking a football around, or whatever it happens to be. The more inviting we can make our premises, and the less institutional we can make our premises, and the more we can staff our premises with local people, the better. Berenice, one question.
Jess has actually joined us, so
Great.
welcome, Jess. So you've seen Jess on the Communities Driving Change pre-recorded video, where she introduced very kindly our Communities Driving Change program at Bromley by Bow. And so, Jess, we're just talking about how to avoid inequality when reaching out to the community, and making sure that we reach out to the right people and not just the people who are keen and engaged. So maybe you want to add to what Dan has been discussing, because you're so involved with community members.
Sure. So yeah, I think this question of like we sometimes call them the usual suspects, who might get involved at any opportunity possible, or be the people who perhaps have more access to local information and more resources to go out and seek it. Like, they're welcome to join our program as well, but I think we do make an active effort to be reaching people who might not be in that privileged position. In terms of the way the program is set out, we identified geographical areas to start working in, which the way that selection happened was through like grassroots engagement, speaking to people, but also desk-based, looking at data and the kind of social and economic situations of the areas. One of the things that I found that is helpful and tends to get people involved who might not be, is just to be really out there, and to think about what kind of barriers people might have to accessing and hearing about your project, and try and just go to the estates and have these big, fun, visible events where everyone's welcome, particularly like families, getting the children to stop and play, and then having an opportunity to speak to their parents. And in addition to that, just trying to look exhaustively at all of the different institutions that are operating in the area, faith groups, play groups, like voluntary sector. It's all about linking up as much as you can.
Yeah, and how does it work at the moment with obviously the pandemic situation and not being able to have those events in person?
Yeah, thanks, Berenice. It's tough. I'd say, so from the presentation, most of you probably gather that the majority of our services are resident-led. During the pandemic, people had fewer resources to be leading things. So we made a choice to be also, in addition to nurturing and looking out for our current engaged participants, to be putting on some opportunities for new people to get engaged. We've done a coaching course, an online facilitation course for people who want to run groups online. We have had some collaborative filmmaking workshops and some photography groups. We're currently doing a pottery group. So these sort of things, in addition to what we're doing already, are bringing in a few people, but I think it's fair to say that it's definitely not enough, and that these activities are only really accessible to people who are connected digitally. So the project's currently looking at a way of doing some doorstep chats and fostering some kind of network building and connections on local levels in a physical sense to people who can't access those additional things.
Does anyone have any questions following up on this for Jess? She's here for 5 more minutes, so if anyone has any questions, now is the time. Yeah, Jen.
Hi, Jess. This is really interesting because the project that me and Phoebe, who's one of the other fellows, is working on is all about population health and engaging communities. So this is all brilliant, fascinating stuff, and I just want to ask you a million questions. But about, on the video you talked about kind of sort of meeting people where they are and enhancing their existing capabilities, and I'd just be interested to know kind of how you do that without kind of sort of doing to people. So for example, I'm kind of focusing on helping people with physical activity, but it's really hard to kind of avoid that, oh, we can tell you all about how to do this. So do you just have any advice on how you kind of build on what's already there without that kind of power sort of being with us?
I think time is your friend. I don't know if it is within your projects here, but like an example I could use would be that one of my team worked in quite a slow way with the community. Well, actually not a slow way. We did this 100-day challenge that was all about getting a bit of momentum. And the 100-day challenge, I can't remember if I mentioned it on the presentation, but it was all about getting different stakeholders into the room, like professionals, or like community workers, like the police, residents, to define like what the key issues are and then commit to working together on it for 100 days. So there's 3 core elements: day 1, day 50, day 100. Day 100 is when everything like culminates, and obviously there's work going on in between. And this one group, they wanted to organize a community walk, and so people worked together to organize the walk. The walk was really successful. On the walk they decided, we're going to have a regular walking group, and then the regular walking group, during those conversations, were like, we'd like to do some exercise. So then they got a women's aerobic class set up. So yeah, I guess it's just like patience and listening and working with people and having faith that people do know what they want and what they need.
Yeah, and I think that's helpful, and I think we keep coming back to the fact that we need to trust that people do know what they want and what they need. We just don't often ask them. So maybe, yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
Any more?
Does anyone have any other questions? Oh, Nikita, come on, go on.
Hi, I was just going to ask about how when you identify people who might be able to contribute and who are, but some who are potentially raising a loud enough voice to be heard, but raising issues which might not be in keeping with what the general idea of the CDC is, or what some other people want, is how do you use everyone as an asset in this situation?
Gosh, there's quite a lot in there. And it's a really good point. I think the broad scope of our program has meant that we have on a couple of occasions had to have some kind of conversations, and there has been conflict, as there often is in community work, because people's ideals of what their community would look like are not always the same. And I think, yeah, I think it's a great opportunity to be able to run a project with such an open kind of remit. Things that we've had kind of issues around are the scope of the project. Maybe people have had, they've come to us where perhaps they've got an idea that's a lot bigger than us, actually, because we're like an estate-based project. So what we've done there is try and link up with people like the local, like CVS, who have lots of support for people who might want to start up a charity, something like that. But yeah, I mean, I can give you a couple of examples of conflicts as well that have come up, like to do with people's views and opinions. The leader of the cycling group was quite upset when people wanted to have a women's only cycle group, and he's a gentleman. He said, you know, we're going backwards, we want everyone to be doing this together. And yeah, I think the answer is it needed? Do people want it? And if they do, if enough people do, and there is a demand, then like go for it. And you find out that way. And the women's group hasn't properly started yet, but like this man's going to be maybe kind of retreat a bit if he sees that that's really, really popular. But yeah, I think some like awkward and difficult conversations have come about because of that, to do with, oh, you're separating people, etc. Communities are messy.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, oh, sorry, go for it.
Oh, Varsha, sorry. I was just going to ask, it's kind of following on from that, but I was wondering, in those situations, I'm trying to get my head around the balance of trying to make people as equal as possible, kind of between volunteers, the community, and the paid, the professionals. And I was wondering, on a day-to-day basis, on a kind of practical level, how you try and make those relationships as equal as possible in the healthcare centre and in the community centre.
Probably not the best person to speak about the health centre, but I could say briefly about what we do in communities driving change. I think there are always power dynamics, particularly when there's a paid community worker, and I think that sometimes paid staff do become community leaders, and that's not always a big problem, because sometimes we do have a bit more of a repertoire of what could be possible and what could happen. But it's a game of dancing between being like, or like giving ideas and then seeing if people want to go with them rather than doing them ourselves. And it is a new way of working that some people do struggle to kind of get to grips with. You know, you're being paid, why aren't you doing this hard work? But I think people like it or lump it, and we have come across some people who are like, I'll just give you all of the ideas, you do it, and nothing happens. I don't know if Dan or Berenice have anything to say about the health centre and power dynamics.
I was just thinking, like, we can ask, so Naseem is coming on later in the session to answer some questions as well.
She's brilliant.
Yeah, exactly. Obviously, going from the DIY health perspective, she can answer that probably a bit better than we can. I think Varsha had a question.
Thanks, Berenice. Jess, that was really, really interesting. Mine's more a very kind of research-based question. In terms of the digital poverty, you were talking about how that came to the fore with the pandemic. Was there a movement within BBBC to kind of understand sections of where digital poverty were and how to address it? Or was it sort of fly by the seat of your pants and just go for it?
I think a bit of both. Because at the same time as recognizing digital poverty in the community, we were all suddenly having to be like working remotely and doing all of our tech. So yeah, it was definitely a little bit of fly by the seat of our pants. But we at the Bromley by Bow Centre, we have a group that's all about digital inclusion. And we meet on a regular basis to discuss like some of the key issues and how we're feeding into particularly like future projects. Like the ESOL team managed to get some funding to enable their ESOL learners to access tablets, to like loan tablets. An awful lot of work has gone on behind the scenes to support these people to use them, but I think in a way it's been really positive that we this issue has become so visible. There's a lot to do.
Dan, do you want to add on to that?
No, I mean, just to say, we've been working on digital exclusion ever since I've been at Bromley by Bow, which is 22 years now. So in a sense, it's not something that's new to us. What I think, obviously, it came even further to the fore under lockdown, really. And again, if you talk to community centres and community organisations, as I have done across London, this has, had a massive effect. Not just actually digital exclusion, but also the fact that centres that people used to go to, be they faith centres, faith organisations, be they community organisations, were all closed. And for many of our community, the way that they access services is physical. It's by going into centres and talking to people. And you've got a whole lot of what are called, to use the jargon, trusted intermediaries. People who hear people having conversations and say, oh, I think you should go and see so-and-so, they can help you with that. And all those trusted intermediary type contacts that people used to have in their physical contacts that people had in their communities just stopped happening because these centres were closed. So it's not just digital exclusion, it's also the physical exclusion for people whose utter preference is for face-to-face provision. And that included, of course, primary care itself. 50% of consultations went online. Well, actually, they didn't go online, they went on telephone. Interestingly, GPs didn't want to see their patients on video calls. The number of video calls actually dropped under lockdown considerably. It went from less than 1% to about 0.5%. And so, it all went on the telephone, actually, which is really interesting. But I read something alarming yesterday that Matt Hancock said that he wants 45% of GP consultations to be online post-lockdown, post-COVID. He wants what happened under COVID to now become the norm forever. Yeah.
Thank you. Just to say bye to Jess. She's just gone to another meeting, so she's going.
Bye.
Sorry.
Have a good day.
Thank you.
So much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, cool. Just having a look at, actually we can talk a little bit about the language question, Dan. Someone is asking, do you have translators for people that cannot speak English to access the centre and use the services? It's a good question.
Yeah, so we employ a lot of local people who do speak local community languages, but we are also in a community where well over 100 languages are spoken. I think it may even be around 200 languages are spoken. So, so yes, certainly there is extensive use of translation services, telephone translation services, and I know that within the health practices, you know, there is a lot of use of that when needed. Under pre-lockdown conditions, certainly, you know, we would have certainly the main community languages. Our main community language is actually Sylheti, which is a dialect of Bangladeshi. We have a lot of staff who are of Bangladeshi heritage who speak Sylheti, for example. So there's something also interesting that I remember when I started at Bromley by Bow in Tower Hamlets, which is 22 years ago now. There was a great fashion for translating leaflets into community languages. That has really fallen by the wayside now. I think the realization that many of our community, although they speak community languages and may not have mastered English very well, they often don't read and write in their own community languages. So translating leaflets isn't always particularly helpful. But that's interesting. But yes, you do need translators, and we use translation lines, yeah.
There was also earlier a question about, is there a citizen leaflet for Unleashing Communities report? Healthy communities, sorry.
There isn't a leaflet, but there's a summary report, yeah. Yeah. I think it has to be said though, that we think, you know, leaflets are, and posters are significantly overrated in their utility. You know, and this, you can prove it for yourselves. You can fly a whole neighborhood and tell them about a meeting next Wednesday evening to discuss X or Y or Z. And you will get, you know, you can put 3,000 leaflets through 3,000 letterboxes and you will get the same 10 people turn up to that meeting who pretty much turn up to every meeting. So the belief that leaflets and posters are effective means of transmission of information is really misunderstood, we think. They sometimes work as a way of reinforcing a conversation. So you have a chat to somebody and you say, oh, we've got this great thing happening at Bromley by Bow, do come along, and here's a leaflet. The leaflet has some validity then in terms of reinforcing the idea. But just filling GP waiting rooms with leaflet racks or community centres with walls of leaflets is virtually useless.
Thank you, Dan. So I think there are some other questions and some other themes we'd like to talk about a little bit later on. Yep. But what I'm going to suggest is that we go into breakout rooms now, and then we can continue the conversation. We have some more time allocated for this. But what would be great is, so we'll go into rooms and basically discuss. So I know you've been working on projects during this program, as Phoebe and Jen have mentioned. But so I'm assuming that's something that's a question that's already familiar, but we wanted you to think a little bit about how do you see co-production applying to your work and what opportunities and challenges you might face in doing this. So I think it's probably a question you've already talked about. But like we've got 10 minutes now to kind of in groups talk about this. And then Dan will be kind of, you know, popping in and out of the rooms to check with you and check if you have questions. I think little groups are sometimes quite nice to spur some conversation, and then maybe if you have anything specific that comes out of those conversation, we can talk about it in the time just after the breakout rooms. So we'll have 10-minute breakout room and then 5-minute tea break. So maybe you can have your tea at the same time, but yeah, you'll have 5 minutes after that. So so yes, so that means that 11:10 we're gonna all come back to this to the main group. So I'll now put you into the breakout rooms. It's groups of 3 or 4, and you can start chatting if that's okay. Does anyone have any questions about this, or everybody happy? All right, Cool. So you should have the message now in a minute. Welcome back, everybody. So sorry, there's one group that didn't get done in the room because we don't have time. But if you did come up with questions, now is the time to ask them. We can have a chat all together now. So did the last group have any questions for Dan or for the rest of the group, really? No?
I don't think we had anything specific.
All right, that's fine. Just coming back quickly to some of the questions that were asked before, there was a question about so considering the activities began with the church precinct, within the church precinct, how do you equalize the various faiths and diversities coming to use the services to be mindful of differences? All this while embracing the diversity, Dan?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It's never really been a bit an issue for Bromley by Bow, actually, I think. I think partly, actually, our church took a direct hit in the Second World War, and that building that you saw is a 1950s rebuilt church. It doesn't really look like a church, actually, which is helpful. But actually, I mean, you know, the first thing we did was start to employ local people, including a number of Bangladeshis as our community outreach workers. We created a multicultural outreach team, and it never really has been an issue. Our biggest party, our biggest festival every year is our Eid celebration, which is in the park, and about 1,000 people come and have a curry lunch together on the park green of all faiths. I mean, we celebrate each other's faiths. That's the thing. We celebrate each other's faiths. So it's never really been an issue at Bromley by Bow. And we went on to found a food bank that is, you know, run by about 3 churches, some mosques, the Sikh temple, the Jewish organization in East London, a university, an arts organization, Bromley by Bow, and a housing association, and the Rotary Club. And we all came together to found and set up a food bank about 7 years ago, for example. I think actually often people of faith recognize that people of other faiths are very much like them in the sense that they hold spiritual values. So I think there's quite a lot to think about there, actually, yeah. But it's not been an issue at Bromley by Bow, for sure.
Georgina wanted to know about so how much time in the week do the GPs have for non-standard GP work? So running groups, etc. And are the job plans different for Bromley by Bow GPs than they are for other practices?
I think this is a really interesting question, and I sometimes tell a joke about alligators at this point. How do you get alligators? You know, there's that story about the alligator that takes a little furry animal across the river, and right on the other bank, the alligator flips the animal up, and as the animal's about to descend into the open jaws of the alligator, the furry animal says, you know, why did you do that? And the alligator says, but that's because I'm an alligator. How do you get clinical staff to not behave like clinical staff, I think is a really challenging one, actually. And of course, I think that the challenge is that, you know, our GPs come into work at 8 o'clock in the morning, and they're probably lucky to be going home at 8:30 in the evening, having done a shed load of paperwork, and that's every single day. And I think that is a real challenge. I think finding time and making time, and I would say our GPs probably argue that they do not have enough ability to find time and make time to do other things. And that is always a constant challenge. What they have done within our general practices is to create a non-clinical team. That's not the Bromley by Bow charity team. That's employed within general practice. They have a non-clinical team, including Nassim, who you're going to meet in a minute. So they've decided that to take money that could have otherwise been spent on the salary of a GP or a couple of nurses or whatever it happens to be, and they've decided to employ a non-clinical team within general practice to work with groups of patients differently. And that's, I think, been one of their responses. In a sense, if you think about it, you know, GPs, I don't know how much it costs to train a GP. I think it's about £1 million or something like that it costs to train a GP. You definitely want GPs, therefore, to be doing GP work. You know, they're the most expensive people in the system in primary care. What you want are fewer GPs doing the things that only GPs can do. You kind of want this tiering system where everybody sees the most appropriate person within, say, general practice, where you've got health literacy workers, health program workers working with groups of patients around long-term conditions. Then you've got healthcare assistants, you've got nurses, nurse practitioners, physician assistants, and then finally at the apex, you've got the GPs. You ideally want the GPs to be least in number because they're the most specialized within the whole system. And you want the GPs only to be seeing patients who only need to see a GP. And that's the ideal. And so, you know, this constant refrain that, you know, Britain was, I can't remember how many tens of thousands GPs short. I mean, our GPs would say, no, the UK is not short of GPs. It's probably got too many GPs. It needs more other people in the system. We need to have a much, 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 much more diverse workforce within primary care. GPs are not the answer because the problem is not the one that the people think it is. So, you know, that's something to think about, yeah.
Georgina, does that answer your questions or your question or?
Yeah, thank you. That's so helpful. And I particularly how sort of strongly you put that. It's almost like there needs to be a complete reframing of what primary care is and needs to be. Thank you.
Yeah, we've got a triangular, if you can imagine a pyramid with horizontally sliced into 4. The bottom slice we call primary care, which is you and yourself and you looking after your own health. Secondary care, which is the next layer above that, is you, yourself, plus family and closest friends. Tertiary care is you, yourself, plus family and friends, plus your neighborhood and the community organizations within your neighborhood. And the fourth little tip of the pyramid is the NHS. So we've completely redefined primary, secondary, and tertiary care as not being the NHS at all. And then if everything else fails, there's the NHS. And then you start to think, if we're spending £130 billion a year on the NHS, 95% of that is treating people who are already ill, and 5% of that is spent on trying to stop people from becoming ill. Well, I think we will mark a success when we look at that £130 billion and find that it's been spent radically differently, which is investing in the bottom 3 rungs of that diagram that I've just described, i.e. investing in people in communities and not in treating people who are, you know, not in illness, but in creating health and well-being.
Yeah.
I mean, to contrast that, Public Health England's budget is £3 billion, by the way. So our health prevention agency gets £3 billion a year, and treating sick people gets £130 billion a year.
How would you redress that though? Because isn't it like 57% or something of the budget goes to the acutes?
Yes, exactly. It's all in hospitals, yeah. So really interesting statistic for you all. 95% of NHS contact is in primary care. 8% of the NHS budget is in primary care. So we've got to shift money out of hospitals and into primary care, and we've got to shift money out of primary care and into the community. We've got to sort of trickle this money down very quickly. And it means having courage. I mean, the problem is that all of the NHS rhetoric has been about what I've just said, but all the direction of travel of the money has been to concentrate more and more. What you do is you employ more and more specialist consultants in hospitals who come up with ever fancier and more sophisticated and more expensive treatments for tiny numbers of patients, often very close to the end of their lives. And you just suck more and more money into hospitals by doing that. And we need to stop this whole thing of specializing and sophisticating. I mean, it's great. On one level, it's fantastic, and don't get me wrong. But on another level, it doesn't allow, the direction of travel of the money has been in the opposite direction to the rhetoric over the last 30 years. So the rhetoric's in one direction, the money's traveling in the other. We need to have some courage, and we need to be insistent, and we need to be forthright. I don't know if there are other questions.
Dan, would it be helpful to have a chat about the social prescribing scheme as a kind of a link? Sorry, I had.
Yeah, sure. Okay, we've got a couple of minutes before Nassim joins us, is that right?
Yeah.
So I don't know if everybody's familiar with social prescribing. If anybody's unfamiliar, could you shout out and just unmute yourselves and cry? Or does everybody understand what social prescribing is? Hopefully that means that everybody understands. Okay. So we were amongst the founders of social prescribing at Bromley by Bow. When we built in the general practice into our model, that's when we started to create social prescribing, really. It's expanding rapidly. We've now got 7.5 link workers for our primary care network. We see social prescribing as shift, the NHS adopted social prescribing 3 years ago and agreed to fund initially 1 link worker in each of the 1,250 primary care networks in England, moving to, within about 4 years, I think about 4 link workers, 5 link workers per primary care network, along with the employment of a similar number of health and wellbeing coaches and care coordinators. So we're starting to see the NHS recognizing this idea of having non-clinical staff within primary care. We think it could go a lot further than that, and but we've already gone to the point where we have 7.5 link workers for our primary care network, and some of them are employed by the charity, and some of them are employed by the health partnership. And you're going to meet one of them in a second, who's called Nassim. But just to give you an interesting insight into another development we're trying to develop at Bromley by Bow, which is, I don't know if you all know this, but within primary care, you have teams who do what are called call and recall about patients with long-term health conditions, which are very, very clinically focused conversations, and often it's prior to getting patients to come in for an annual health check, for example. We think that we need to rewrite the script of all of those conversations. Those conversations between the call and recall staff, we think, should start to become quasi-social prescribing conversations, for example. We need to make really our first conversation with everybody a conversation that is about how are you, what matters to you, what's going on with you at the moment, how can we help you, and that or how might you like us to help you, and what could we help you with. And that conversation, we believe, should not be guided by the job title of the person sitting in front of you. So if you're a welfare benefits advisor or an employment advisor, or you're a nurse or a GP or a member of the call and recall team, we believe that that first conversation should be a bit of an open exploration of what matters to you. Because otherwise, all you do is get welfare benefits advisors talking to people about welfare benefits, or employment advisors talking to people about employment, or nurses talking to people about their diabetes, or whatever it is. And we need to have a broader recognition of the human being in front of us, really, as a starting point. And then, of course, referral to whoever might be able to support them with other needs, in addition to the needs that we can help them with. I hope that's helpful. So we're on a journey with social prescribing, and it's in its infancy at the moment, I think, social prescribing, and it's got a long way to go. And it's a very exciting time for social prescribing here. And is Nassim here with us yet?
Yes, she just joined us. Hi, Nassim. I think you're still on mute.
Hi there.
Welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Okay, so we had actually a question earlier in this session, so maybe we'll kick off with that, Nassim. So, question you could potentially answer better than we could. So there was a question about how
how to kind of have an equal relationship between kind of the medical professionals and the community members. So when having co-produced kind of programs and things like that. So how to ensure that everybody is kind of on an equal, on an equul basis.
So one of the things we do is we don't wear name badges, we don't wear lanyards or anything. Sorry, excuse me, if you have a phone. Sorry about that.
No worries.
Yes, so we don't wear any badges when we're having, especially when we do the DIY, so that everybody's starts with the equal footing as well. And then what we also do is there's everybody, when anyone comes into the DIY or anywhere, we just treat them like an equal. So they'll just come in, help with they'll help at set up the table, set up anything that needs to be done. And it's having a conversation on equal terms, not saying that, oh, we're a health professional and you're a part of the community. I think it's a learning process for both the facilitator, co-facilitator. That's the whole thing. It's having co-facilitating. So you're doing it together as a group rather than having separate titles. Does that help at all?
Yeah, if you'd like. Marsha, go on.
Oh, sorry. Can I just ask a very quick follow-up question? Nassim, I really enjoyed your DIY program. I think equalization is so important. But I wonder, when you're leading a conversation or trying to suss out what's actually going on, do you then ask open-ended questions towards the end, or do you just watch it organically go ethnographically? How do you manage that situation? Thank you.
So what happens is, if it's we ask open-ended questions, but then if we're concerned about something during our little break, I can just go to one side and just get that details from them. Just ask them how it's going, what's what they're struggling with, but in an informal way. Is that helpful?
Yeah, thank you. So is there an opportunity for, I think I'm just struggling with the equal footing.
Sorry.
Because no, you're fine. I'm sorry. Can you hear me? It's just more when we're asking open questions, are we not setting, is there a precedent then set that this is the question asker, or is it like an open forum where everyone
It's an open forum, anybody can ask questions. There is no such thing as that this person, we normally go around in groups, and then as people get more confident, they just start asking questions, and it doesn't have to be related to that topic. It could be anything they want to discuss. And that's really, really important.
Thank you.
Does anyone have any specific questions about DIY health? Oh, Helen, you have unmuted yourself. Go on.
Thank you. If something comes up, Nassim, when people are asking questions, because presumably they're answering each other's questions, it's not just you answering the questions.
Sure,
so if something comes up, false information, how do you work with that?
How do we work with that? So what we do is, what we always say is use the NHS websites. That's the best way of information. So that's how we work. We just make sure that everything is from the NHS website rather than just hearsay or false news. But there's lots of other things, like people as parents, as you know, there's grandparents coming up with different things. So like, people weren't sure about, I'll give you an example. Honey was the biggest thing, because in the Asian cultures, honey is classed as a very, it's quite important, and they normally give it to babies when they're immediately born. So overcoming that it's about discussing and why it shouldn't be given. And I think that helped a lot with a lot of people. It's having the evidence to say why it's not. And if you don't have the evidence, then we'll discuss it the next time. But that's something we will always go back and make sure everybody fully understands the importance of the correct things.
So if people share sort of their opinions on things, you try and
yes, of course,
kind of give the evidence for it.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Is there any other questions for Naseem about how the sessions are run, or?
Do the sessions have GPs in them ever?
No, we don't. What we do is we do have a GP on call. So if there is anything we're struggling with or we're not sure, we can always just go back to them and ask them. And sometimes they do come in, we can invite them and just have a little chat just so that they know we've got a face to. It's just so that they're used to seeing a GP as well. They're not in, oh my gosh, I can't ask them this question. They feel comfortable for future as well. So yeah, we do invite them, not every time, but we do invite them on a few occasions.
And going back to the honey example, obviously you said you go back to the evidence, but you would hope that someone else in the group would know that evidence and come forward and tell everyone.
Yeah, of course. No. People, there's always a big discussion, because some will say, oh no, but this is what we were grown up with. And then somebody will say, no, but this is what's happened. So it's a really good, lively group discussion.
Okay, and you're facilitating it. You're not disseminating information, because obviously you can sit there and say, well, I know the latest information on honey is this, and that will close down the conversation quite quickly.
No. It's quite important that people have a chance to speak. Sure.
So your role really is to get everybody together
and just
then to kind of, do you set an agenda about what's going to be spoken about that?
No. Again, it's the parents. Every week they will decide what they want to discuss. So we'll get some things ready for them, and then we'll just have a discussion around then, and then from there, say if it's coughs and colds, we'll sort of have a little quiz, because there's an interaction as well. So we might have a quiz, or we might have some sort of interaction, a game, so that people learn from there as well. But but everybody gets involved.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
No one else was a burning one, Naseem. I'm so sorry. I'm really interested in this. So do you mind if I ask?
No, that's fine.
I just wonder, because, we come with the hat of healthcare professionals, and I'm putting us in a silo, but I always wonder whether it might make sense to maybe include the GPs in this, so almost understanding how to equalize the whole plane. Does that happen at all, where you'll have consistently thought maybe add the GPs to these discussions, because then they understand the social constructs behind which their patients are coming? I know that Dan explained that you have, different levels to reach the GP, but then does it not make sense to equalize that at some point of time so everyone's on the same page?
GPs are very approachable. Where we work, GPs can come in and they can have a chat. But the thing is, it's about having that safe environment. When I say safe, where they feel comfortable to begin with, and then we do like I said, we do invite them in if there's something we're not sure of. But I think the whole point is that they want to get themselves confident without the GP being there, feeling, yes, we can, giving them, almost being empowering them to say we can do this without having a GP present. So it's equal. But yeah, no, we can. If somebody wants to see a GP, we can call them in. It usually, it can happen. And they feel more comfortable as well. So when they go and see a GP, they feel that they know what to say, what to ask, and they've got all that knowledge behind them as well.
Thanks, Naseem. And usually does this feedback, sorry, my follow-up questions are many, but
okay.
Does these notes or what the discussions are then feedback to other parts of the health practice or the community practice? Because then again, it's about like engaging a conversation between.
Oh yes, yeah. We always do a feedback as well at the end. So patients, parents will write down what helped them, what worked for them, what didn't work for them, how it could be improved, and what they found useful. And that goes back, and we always look at that. That's really important, that bit is as well.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Just to ask a question myself, Naseem, what sort of spaces does this take place in? So DIY Health and so on? What
So
sort of...
we have it at the GP practices. So we have a room which we've done really well, where we've put lots of cushions out for them. So everything's sort of quite fun and it's safe. But then there's also at children's centres as well. So we used to have it at children's centres as well. So that's and we're hoping back in January, not January, in the new year sometime, we'll start these sessions again. But I think it was a valuable, it was really valuable for the parents. And I think even more so with COVID right now. I think there's such a big demand for it.
And I mean, I've seen some of these sessions myself. I mean, there's... well, I remember some, they had like a rug on the floor and there were toys.
Yes, yeah. So we have
lots of refreshments and things like that.
Yeah. So we bring in, we've started bringing healthy stuff, and it's all about letting the children play with each other. So it's not just about the parents thinking, oh, we've come here for a session. It's socializing as well, and that's really important, whether it's for the parents or whether it's for the children, because that interaction is so special. And we have different sessions, like we have say for eczema, we might just have watering somewhere where the kids can have a little play, and then how to put lotion on, how to put creams on. So it's all very interactive in that session, in those groups. Every week there's always something we do. So we could have nursery rhymes, and everybody sits on the floor. Children sit on the floor, they can be crawling around playing with toys, and it's very comfortable, very safe and fun as well. We'll have crayons for the older children so they can sit and colour if they want to do that. Yeah.
Naseem, hi, I'm Jen. Can I ask you a question that's in stark reality to the nice social side of things? But how do you evaluate the programme and the impact that it's having? What are you measuring?
So I know there's lots of different things. I can't answer everything, but what I can do is I can get back to you and answer that. I know there's we know there's reduction in GP consultations. We did it before and after the DIY started, so 3 months before and 3 months and after that as well. And there's also reduction in all health services, whether it's A&E, whether it's out of hours. So there is a huge reduction in there as well. But what I can do is I can get back to you on and give you the exact figures. But there is evaluation we do, yeah.
Brilliant, thank you very much.
Great, thank you. If there's no other questions for Naseem, I think we can let her go now. We're right on time, so that's perfect. And so, yeah, thank you, Naseem, for joining us.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
All right, great. So we're coming to the last 15 minutes of this session. So I think it would be helpful to kind of reflect on, Dan, what do you think? Should we talk a little bit about, like, come back to what are the opportunities and enablers for, creating co-production projects and programs?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've covered them fairly extensively, but just thinking about the constraints that sorry, that's a bit of a ramble. The King's Fund report that we've contributed so extensively, that had the roundtable yesterday, was really interesting in the sense that it was also, and you'll hopefully it'll be published in the next few weeks, and you'll get to see it. It was Ben, who wrote it for the King's Fund, was really interesting in sort of trying to say, well, actually, you don't need to do a Bromley by Bow. There are lots of small things that you can do that sort of take learning from Bromley by Bow and indeed many other places and kind of implement them in say, primary care. And we can transform or begin the journey of transformation sort of small step at a time. You don't need to knock everything down and build a new centre and redevelop a 3-acre park and employ 100 staff in a charity kind of thing. And I think that's really important to hang on to, that there are small steps that one can take. I think potentially the biggest challenge is around culture, the culture within the NHS, the culture of kind of, if you like, biomedical health. and the culture of institutions. And as one of the GPs also on the roundtable yesterday pointed out, it's not just within the health system, it's local authorities as well. So I think that is a real starting point, that what we're talking about here is a cultural transformation as much as anything else. And I think what Nassim talked about is really important, about how you dress. You know, you dress in clothing that doesn't signify a great difference in status. We don't wear, as you said, lanyards and badges. We introduce ourselves by our first names, and we try to spend a bit of time getting to know the person we're talking to. We don't immediately walk in with a whole set of mental sort of tick boxes in our heads about these are the things that I'm trying to achieve in this conversation with this person, but actually understand that in engaging with any other person in a conversation, it is a dialogue, it's two people. And therefore it's not just about the agenda that you might have in your head, but the person you're speaking to has also undoubtedly got things that they want to talk about, and they may not be the same things. As somebody put it in a role play that we did recently, going off script as soon as possible is what you should be aiming to do. Find the thing that is of interest to the person you're talking to and explore that thing. Make them feel that you've listened to them and what's important to them, and start to work on that as a point of departure for the conversation, rather than having this sort of, you know, institutionally devised sort of list of things that I need to talk to this person about. So the recognition of that other person as another human being, I think, is something that our really skilled workers do at Bromley by Bow. The environment is important, making the environment feel friendly, making it feel semi-domestic in some way. And as we've just described, cushions and carpets and rugs and toys and, you know, whatever one can do to try to kind of break down the formality of the environment is probably also really important. I think working with groups of people is often helpful, rather than just working with individuals. I think that's also important. But we've got about 10 minutes left, Berenice. I mean, I don't know if we want to just throw this out for people to make comments or ask questions further.
There's some more questions in the chat box, actually, Dan.
Okay, yeah.
There's a question about WhatsApp groups. Is there a link worker as a facilitator for the group for DIY health and I guess other WhatsApp groups as well? And are there elements of GDPR that are there to ensure and protect privacy? Sorry.
Yeah, so the WhatsApp group in DIY health is not a link worker. It's one of the DIY health team who runs that group. Yes, WhatsApp is great. It's the, I think, most accessible digital platform that people know about and understand. Of course, one does have to get consent with people because they are effectively sharing their phone numbers with each other. So everybody has to agree. GDPR is massively challenging in this sort of environment in terms of what we're trying to do, which is, you know, is difficult. And I learned recently of GP practices that are running group sessions with patients, you know, like exercise groups and all sorts of things like that, and having to get everybody to sign consent forms just so that the other patients can see them on a Zoom group session. You know, there's because there's a digital image of them on the session, and they're having to get everybody to, I mean, I have no idea whether that's necessary or not. It seems quite extreme. I can believe it probably is necessary. It's just, this stuff is if we're not careful, will make it very, very difficult to do a lot of the things that we're trying to do. And I'm completely, of course, conversant with the need for, you know, kind of good digital and you know, practice around GDPR and so on. But I think we have to kind of, to some extent, be proportionate about some of these things as well. But WhatsApp is by far the easiest sort of way of people kind of sharing. We find we've done. I mean, under lockdown conditions, we've made community films where literally we started whole new groups who had no idea about filmmaking and got everybody up to speed with filmmaking, all in their own homes, and how they collectively edited a film together and produced a film together. With virtually no physical contact with the filmmaker and the community worker who was organising that. quite an astonishing feat, really. But that, you know, so one can do amazing things, but it has to be said, we are all waiting the day when we can start to go back to doing more physical things, you know. Whilst we have overcome huge amounts of barriers through digital platforms and working remotely, there are undoubtedly, you know, things that are very challenging for our community and that will go on being challenging around digital. And the quality of the interaction, I mean, just look at us now, we'd be sitting in that lovely church, sitting around the table right now, discussing things together, or sitting in the pews in our church and having some tea and biscuits and kind of wrapping up the session or something. So, you know, it's not the same. I think it has to be recognized, really. How do you communicate all the options between the groups as signposting to the correct person once? Well, I think, yeah, I mean, I think there's an imperfection in everything. You can't necessarily lay out, well, you have a discussion with people. Certainly this is what social prescribing link workers do. One of the interesting things about social prescribing link workers is that they try to focus people on just doing a couple of things. You know, people may have a multiplicity of needs in their lives. People have a limited bandwidth in terms of their ability to take, you know, umpteen things forwards at once. So we find it actually much better to focus on one or two things. And similarly, it will be for other people. We need to develop, and we are developing a CRM at Bromley by Bow across all of our services that will allow for cross referral between any service within Bromley by Bow. But I think for most people within the health system, the response to that will be you get the person to a link worker, social prescribing link worker, who can then take that process forwards, rather than clinicians trying to support people to access lots and lots of different services, which is not in the skill set or the knowledge set of clinicians. Yeah, consistency of services and reliability with volunteers is a challenge. We find that a lot of community-led projects don't always endure forever. We have we've run for many, many years at Bromley by Bow sort of micro grant projects for local people to bid for small amounts of money, you know, usually a few £100 up to probably about £500 to run small community projects. And we often create a community panel that votes on which projects get funded. And then we support the local people to develop their projects. And we've been doing this for years and years at Bromley by Bow. Some of those projects endure for a long, long time, and some of them only last for a few months. I think one does have to accept that not everything runs forever. People's motivations and passions and people's time, you know, changes over time. And I think that's also true in the voluntary sector itself. I mean, one of the challenges for social prescribing link workers across the country is that the voluntary sector's funding is often very short term for particular projects. And so projects are continually coming to an end. And, you know, it's not uncommon for projects that social prescribing link workers have come to rely on tremendously to accept referrals about a particular need in that community may well come to an end because the funding for that project comes to an end. And the link worker is left with the challenging situation of how do they then fulfill something similar to that for their clients. And I think that's one of the real challenges within our communities, and one that we think, you know, needs addressing, which is we need a much greater stability of funding for funded projects. The other thing to say is that volunteers often need support. Volunteers often need ongoing support. With those small grants programs that I described before, what we try to often do is get the local residents who want to run small projects to be homed within an organisation, be it a community centre, a children's centre, where there are paid professionals who can kind of support those local residents in running a community-led project. So finding a home for community projects where there are kind of willing and capable professionals who can give a bit of support is one way of increasing the sustainability of volunteer and community-led projects, actually, as well. And is there a tension between, yes, I'm probably going to end on this one, we're going to run out of time. Is there a tension between the health focus of general practice and the ethos of the community centre? And the answer is absolutely yes, there is. Interestingly, there's very little formality between Bromley by Bow, the charity, and Bromley by Bow Health, the health partnership. Our chief exec is a full but non-profit sharing partner in the GP partnership. One of the founding GPs is the deputy chief executive of the charity. And then there's lots of interlinks and crossovers, and sometimes staff who are seconded between the two organisations. And lots of working groups between the two organisations, which is about designing and delivering projects and services together and brainstorming together and all those things as well. But there are tensions. Yes, the primary function of primary care still is around treating sick people, and the demand is fairly relentless, and it's still 10-minute consultations, although we'd like consultation time to be longer. Faced with all of those challenges, and then the charity itself has its other challenges of huge levels of social need. We don't have enough funding for everything, and a lot of our funding is very short term, and we're continually having to repair our funding, if you like, to build new funding back. And the premise of the two organisations is quite different in that respect. One is around clinical care primarily, and one is around community building and social programs. I sometimes liken Bromley by Bow a bit like a marriage or a couple of people who've started living together. There's actually, in a sense, there's never been marriage vows, but it's an imperfect partnership. And sometimes we each get a bit too busy doing our own stuff, and we have to kind of call each other to account, and a bit like a couple trying to find an evening where they can go to a restaurant and have a meal together. There's a lot of that, really, I think, at Bromley by Bow. There's a lot of give and take. There's a lot of non-blame culture, and a lot of, kind of like, let's meet up again and think about the next step of this or the next step of that, or something we used to do really well that we seem to have just stopped doing. How do we rekindle that thing that we used to do? And I think what is the undying thing about Bromley by Bow is that there are some professionals, I mean, I've been there 22 years, but there are people who long outlive me in terms of the time they've been at Bromley by Bow. There are some very, very committed people who have been custodians on the health partnership side and the charity side of the model over 3 decades now, at least. So Bromley by Bow is very important to many of the people who work there. And there's an utter undying belief in the model. There's an undying belief that bringing non-clinical services together with clinical services in an empowering and co-productive way with community is the response to what we need as professionals and what organizations need, but more importantly, what communities need. And that we could not possibly achieve what we're trying to achieve without doing it in this way. And I think it's that undying belief in the model that keeps us all going forwards together with all the imperfections and all the things that we would love to do but can't do for whatever constraints as well. And so it's as much about process as product. I think it's an unending journey. Community has no end. People often say, well, at the end of this project, what are the outputs and outcomes? Well, communities, yes, they have outputs and outcomes, but community life goes on forever. So our endeavor goes on forever, and our relationship with our community goes on forever. And the sort of the twists and changes and the waxing and waning of different things that we do will also go on forever, and the imperfections will go on forever, and the wonderful things that we do will also go on forever. And it's the journey that's important in this as much as anything else, actually, and it's a journey constructed through relationships.
Thank you, Dan. Right on time. So just to kind of finish off, so I've put in the chat box a link to the feedback form. It's only like 3 questions. So if you could just please fill that out, that would be great. So we can make sure we can improve on those kind of sessions, and yeah, get your feedback is always very useful. I've also put in my email address in case you will have any questions for us or for Dan. I can pass it along. So don't hesitate to get in touch if you have any questions, anything you want to know about Bromley by Bow that we haven't touched on today, then yeah, feel free to email. And then I just wanted to mention, we run a knowledge exchange network. We have some monthly meeting with people from different organizations, so from the charity sector, from the research sector. We have some social prescribers. Any kind of people can join, really. And we talk about, so we've been talking about different topics, but recently we've been talking about building resilient communities, and this kind of topics. What is a community? How do we define communities and this kind of things in those it's all about like a little bit more of theory, let's say, and sometimes we link it to practical examples of our work, but really talking about how to influence change, what's our work is about, and this kind of things, but with a very multi-sectoral approach. So if you wanted to join that, in the feedback form, there's the option to put in your contact details. So just put in your email address, and I can add you to the next meeting if you wanted to join this. So Dan, do you want to say a few last words?
No, it's been great to be with you. You're doing really important things. I know that co-production is something that Becky Mulby is passionate about, and Becky Mulby is a great and long-term friend of Bromley by Bows. I think that what you're trying to do is really, really important for the future of the health system. We need absolutely more people who know how to do co-production and who feel passionate about it. And so, yes, as Berenice says, please stay in touch, and we'd love to hear how you're getting on. You will be joining a family of people across Britain and beyond, who are all busy trying to change the way health and community works together. There are many thousands of like-minded thinkers across the world who are busy developing really interesting ideas and really interesting programs, and it's great to have you as part of that wider network of people. So well done, and good luck with your projects.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So much for your time.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.